All right, so today we're going to tackle a pretty big question, one that's been around for centuries. Does God exist?
Only the biggest questions here.
Exactly. But we're going to try to narrow it down a bit. We're specifically looking at arguments for and against the existence of the Christian God and how they relate to something called the cosmological argument. You've given me some really fascinating material to work with here.
It gets into some deep philosophical territory.
Yeah, and it seems like one of the big takeaways is how much our own assumptions about the universe kind of shape our perspective on this whole question.
Absolutely.
So we're going to be unpacking both the theist and atheist viewpoints, and I think it'll be really interesting for listeners to see how those assumptions actually play out.
Yeah, I think so too.
So why don't we start with the foundation? What is the cosmological argument?
Well, it essentially says everything needs a cause, and because the universe exists, it too must have a cause. And that cause, according to the argument, is God.
Okay, so on the surface, it seems pretty logical. You know, we see cause and effect all around us in the everyday world. But applying that same logic to the entire universe is where things get a little more complicated.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about the very beginning of existence, something that we can't, directly observe or test.
Right, and that's where some of the atheist counter-arguments come in. They're basically saying, wait a minute, let's not jump to conclusions here.
Yeah.
So what are some of those counter-arguments? What are they saying?
Well, one of the most interesting challenges comes from the realm of quantum physics. So, for example, there's this phenomenon called quantum tunneling, and this is where particles can seemingly pass through barriers that they shouldn't be able to. It's as if they just pop in and out of existence.
So it's like the rules of cause and effect that we're used to in our everyday world might not actually apply at the quantum level.
That's one interpretation. And if that's the case, it raises some serious questions about whether we can even apply the concept of cause to the very beginning of the universe.
Wow. Okay, that's pretty mind-bending. Now, I'm also seeing another challenge raised in the material, and that's this idea of a brute fact.
Right.
Can you unpack that one a little bit?
Sure. So a brute fact is essentially something that just is. It exists without needing a further explanation. It's like the ultimate stopping point for the question why.
So if the universe is a brute fact, it just exists, and there's no deeper reason or cause behind it.
Exactly, and that really challenges a core assumption of the cosmological argument, the need for a first cause.
Right.
If the universe can simply exist without a cause, then the argument for God as that cause starts to fall apart.
Okay, now let's say for a minute that we do accept the idea of a first cause. Our material raises another really critical point. Why does that first cause have to be the God of Christianity? Why not some other kind of creator or force?
Yeah, that's the key question.
It is.
And it highlights the leap of faith required to go from the concept of a first cause to the specific characteristics we attribute to the Christian God.
It's like saying, okay, something started it all. But how do we know that something is the God that's described in the Bible?
Right. And to bridge that gap, additional assumptions have to be made. For instance, the assumption that God has specifically revealed himself through Christianity, that the Bible is a reliable historical document, and that personal spiritual experiences are evidence of the Christian God.
And each of those assumptions is definitely debatable. Our sources lay out the arguments on both sides. And, it's not about saying one side is right or wrong, but just about understanding the reasoning behind each perspective.
I think that's really important.
Yeah, and it's fascinating because the source material actually argues that atheism might be a less assumptive position than Christianity. That's a pretty bold statement. So how do they support that?
It boils down to what they call minimalism. Atheism at its core is about withholding belief until sufficient evidence is presented. It's not necessarily about claiming that God definitely doesn't exist, but rather saying, I haven't seen enough evidence to convince me.
Okay, so instead of building up this complex belief system, they're starting from a position of, I don't know, but I'm open to being convinced.
Exactly. And this ties into the principle of Occam's razor, the idea that the simplest explanation is usually the best. The source material argues that atheism aligns with this principle because it avoids introducing God as an extra element that needs explaining.
So they're saying, why add another layer of complexity if we don't have to?
Right. They're looking for the most parsimonious explanation, one that relies on what we can observe and verify.
But even then, wouldn't atheists still have to make some assumptions? Like, for example, the assumption that the universe can exist without a creator, or the assumption that our current scientific understanding is on the right track.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's not that atheists make no assumptions. It's that their assumptions tend to be fewer in number. and more closely tied to what we can observe and test in the natural world.
So it seems like we're seeing this tension between two different ways of approaching this question of God's existence. One that starts with the assumption of a creator and seeks evidence to support that belief, and then another that starts from a position of skepticism and demands evidence before accepting that belief.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it.
And the source material actually goes even deeper. It explores the ethical implications of holding these different viewpoints. But we're going to dive into that fascinating discussion in the next part of our deep dive.
Sounds good.
Welcome back. So we're really getting deep into this whole cosmological argument thing, exploring how theists and atheists approach this question of God's existence. And as we just touched on before the break, this debate gets even more interesting, even more fascinating, I should say, when we bring ethics into the equation.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the source material makes this pretty provocative argument. It suggests that Christians actually have an ethical responsibility to acknowledge the level of assumption that's inherent in their beliefs.
That's interesting.
What do you think about that?
Well, it's... it seems to be saying that there's something unethical about holding a belief system that's based on faith rather than empirical evidence.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's quite that simple. The source material isn't condemning faith itself. It's really emphasizing the importance of intellectual honesty and open dialogue.
Right.
So the argument is that by acknowledging the role of assumptions in shaping our beliefs, it allows for more genuine and respectful conversations across different worldviews.
Okay, so it's more about promoting transparency, recognizing that we all come to these discussions with our own preconceived notions.
Exactly. It's about acknowledging the limitations of our own perspectives and being open to the possibility that we might be wrong.
That's a tough one, though. I mean, wouldn't that lead to a lot of uncertainty and doubt?
Yeah.
Especially for someone who's like deeply committed to their faith.
Sure. I mean, there's a certain comfort and stability that comes with believing in something wholeheartedly.
Right.
And the source material acknowledges that. This kind of self-reflection can be challenging.
It can be.
But it ultimately argues that embracing uncertainty and engaging in honest dialogue is essential for both intellectual and spiritual growth.
So it's like saying, let's not shy away from the tough questions, even if they make us uncomfortable.
Yeah, and sometimes that process of wrestling with doubt can lead to a deeper and more nuanced understanding of our own beliefs.
Yeah, I could see that. Okay, so we've talked about the cosmological argument from this really broad perspective, but the source material also kind of zooms in on the specific assumptions that underlie this belief in the Christian God. It actually lays out 7 key assumptions that are often made to arrive at this belief. Do you want to walk us through those?
Sure. So these assumptions are often presented as self-evident truths, but the source material encourages us to, examine them critically. The first assumption is the existence of God itself, which we've already discussed at length.
Right.
Then there's the assumption that this God has chosen to reveal himself to humanity. And this raises a whole host of other questions, like why are there so many different religions, each claiming to have the true revelation? How do we determine which revelation, if any, is authentic?
Right. It's not as straightforward as just saying God has spoken.
Yeah.
You have to really delve into the specifics of each religion's claims.
Absolutely.
Okay, what's the third assumption?
The third assumption is that Christianity is uniquely valid among all religions, meaning it alone possesses the true path to salvation.
Okay.
Which, again, is a pretty bold claim, considering the sheer diversity of religious beliefs throughout history and across cultures.
It is.
The source material acknowledges that. And it goes on to the fourth assumption, the reliability of the historical evidence for Christianity, particularly the Bible.
Yeah, and that's been a subject of intense debate among historians and biblical scholars for centuries. There are questions about the authorship of certain books, potential contradictions within the text itself, and the historical accuracy of some events that are described in the Bible.
Right, and Christians have their own interpretations and defenses of these apparent discrepancies. But the source material encourages us to, consider all sides of the argument.
Okay.
Then there's a big one. The fifth assumption is the resurrection of Jesus. This is presented as the cornerstone of the Christian faith, but it's also an extraordinary claim that would require extraordinary evidence.
And whether the existing evidence meets that threshold is a matter of ongoing debate.
Yeah. The source material highlights the challenges of verifying historical events that occurred centuries ago, especially those that involve supernatural elements.
Okay, so what's next?
The sixth assumption is that Christianity possesses a uniquely valid philosophical framework. In other words, that its worldview and teachings offer the most coherent and compelling explanation of reality.
And that assumption, of course, is open to challenge from other philosophical perspectives,
Yeah.
both religious and secular.
Absolutely.
Okay, and what about the final assumption?
So the seventh assumption is that personal spiritual experiences can be taken as proof of the Christian God. Many Christians point to these subjective experiences as evidence of God's presence and intervention in their lives. However, the source material cautions against equating personal experience with objective truth. After all, subjective experiences can be influenced by a multitude of factors, including cultural conditioning, personal biases, and even psychological states.
So after examining all these assumptions, what is the source material's overall takeaway?
Well, it argues that each of these assumptions, while foundational to Christian belief, is open to legitimate doubt and scrutiny. And it encourages Christians to acknowledge the inherent uncertainty involved in matters of faith.
So it's not about dismissing faith altogether, but approaching it with intellectual honesty and a willingness to engage in meaningful dialogue with those who hold different beliefs.
Right. It's about recognizing that faith, by its very nature, requires a certain degree of trust and acceptance of things that can't be definitively proven. And that's okay as long as we're open and honest about that.
This has been incredibly thought-provoking. We've explored the cosmological argument, delved into the nature of assumptions, and examined the specific assumptions that underpin Christian belief. But we're not done yet. When we come back, we're going to shift our focus to this concept of burden of proof and explore whether one side of this debate bears a greater responsibility to provide evidence for their claims. Welcome back to our deep dive into the cosmological argument. We've been exploring these arguments for and against the existence of God, specifically the Christian God. And now we're going to get into a concept that's crucial to this whole debate, the burden of proof.
Yeah, this question of who has the burden of proof is a key point of contention in any debate, especially one as complex as this one.
So for those who might not be familiar with this concept, can you just break down what we mean by burden of proof?
Sure. So essentially, the burden of proof lies with the person making the claim. It's their responsibility to provide sufficient evidence to support that assertion. The person who's skeptical of the claim doesn't have to disprove it. They simply have to remain unconvinced until adequate evidence is presented.
Okay, so in the context of the God debate, then, who would be carrying that burden of proof?
Well, that's where things get a bit tricky. Theists, particularly Christians, they often argue that the very existence of the universe points to a creator. You know, that the complexity and order we observe demands an explanation that goes beyond chance or natural processes. They point to the cosmological argument as a key piece of evidence.
So they're saying, look at the universe. It's so intricate and awe-inspiring. It couldn't have just happened by accident. There must be a God behind it all.
Right. But atheists counter by saying that the universe itself might be the explanation. They point to scientific theories like the Big Bang and evolution, which offer natural explanations for the universe's origins and the development of life.
So they're basically shifting the burden back to the theists then, saying, okay, you claim there's a God, but what evidence do you have to support that claim? That doesn't rely on just assuming God's existence in the first place.
Exactly. They're essentially saying, show me the evidence for God that doesn't rely on assuming God's existence in the first place.
Now, the source material we're looking at takes a slightly different approach to this burden of proof argument. It argues that the burden might actually be heavier on the side of theists, specifically Christians, due to the nature of their claims.
Interesting.
Why is that?
Well, the argument hinges on the idea that the more extraordinary the claim, the greater the burden of proof required to support it. And the claim that there is a supernatural creator who intervenes in human affairs and offers eternal salvation. That is, by any measure, an extraordinary claim.
So it's like saying if you're going to claim something as monumental and impactful as the existence of God,
Yeah.
you better have some pretty compelling evidence to back it up.
Right. And the source material argues that the evidence often presented, personal experiences, interpretations of scripture arguments from design, that it might not meet that threshold of extraordinary evidence required to justify such an extraordinary claim.
Now, of course, this is just one perspective on this whole burden of proof thing. And there were many different viewpoints on this issue. But it's definitely an important concept to consider as we kind of wrestle with these big questions.
It highlights the fact that these debates are rarely about winning or losing. It's more about understanding the different ways people approach these questions, the assumptions they bring to the table, and the evidence they find persuasive.
Right. Ultimately, it's up to each individual to weigh the evidence and come to their own conclusions.
Right.
And that's the beauty of these philosophical explorations. They challenge us to think critically, question our assumptions, and engage in respectful dialogue with those who hold different views.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the cosmological argument and the God debate, we want to leave you with this final thought. Don't be afraid to grapple with these big questions. Embrace the uncertainty. Explore different perspectives, and continue to seek your own truth. And who knows, maybe in the process you'll discover something new about yourself and the universe we inhabit.
Well said.
Thanks for joining us.